Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I am the Director of Educational Programs here at the National History Academy. And today we are continuing our virtual tour throughout the United States of different historic sites. And we are fortunate enough today to be joined by Susan Philpott from the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. So, Susan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Katie. So excited to show you around the exhibits of the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which I will be doing with pictures. Since the site itself is under construction. So actually what you're seeing now is what you'll be seeing is the exhibits that are being dismantled. So my name is Susan Philpott. I'm a park ranger with the National Park Service. I just do also want to mention that I have a dog named Chester who occasionally likes to let us know that he's around. So if you hear some barking, that's just Chester joining the chat. So this is the park where I work. This is the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. You might not think of a 200-year-old 3-story brick building as a park, but we are part of the National Park Service because this is the historic headquarters of the National Woman's Party founded by Alice Paul. And it's right in the middle of downtown DC. We're right near the Capitol and the Supreme Court building. That white building you see behind there is the Hart Senate office building. So US senators have their offices looking right over our garden. It is now a museum where we tell the story of the fight for women's right to vote. Another word for that is suffrage, and the ongoing struggle for women's equality. And so here you're seeing the inside hallway of the museum with lots of pictures and white marble busts. Now you're looking as if that door is behind you, looking down those walls. You can see all the portraits here, and also the bust right here is someone that maybe you think of when you think of the word women's suffrage. That's Susan B. Anthony. If people know one name in the cause of women's rights, they usually have heard of Susan B. Anthony, who spent her entire life fighting for women's right to vote, for suffrage. She died in 1906, though, so she didn't get to see this fight through to the end. So the story we tell at Belmont Paul is really the story of the next generation of women who took up that fight. And especially, we tell the story of the woman on the bust here, Alice Paul, and the tactics that she used to demand that women win the vote through a constitutional amendment. Now, one thing you might notice as you look here is this great big mirror, and on that mirror is a sticker. So if you were joining me in the hallway of the Belmont Paul Museum and you were standing there and looking in that mirror, it would look like there's a frame around you. So that so it looks like you're one of the people whose pictures are up there on the wall. And that's part of the message here, is because Alice Paul is, maybe the main leader that we talk about, but you can see there's pictures of people all over. And the idea is you don't make change just by one or two people. They might get their names in the history books, but the fight for change involved lots and lots of people. Alice Paul said she saw the movement like a mosaic. Everybody had their one stone that they put in. So that's inviting you to think, see yourself here. So here's a question. Can you picture yourself here? Does this look like a place where you would be included? Well, maybe you're thinking, well, I don't know anything about making change. That's not something I would do. We're going to talk about that a little bit, about all the different ways people do things. But then also maybe you're looking and saying, these look like an awful lot of wealthy women who have portraits painted of them. Maybe all I'm seeing are white faces here. That doesn't look like me. Well, that's a good point. One thing I want to point out is that bust of Susan B. Anthony that you saw on the pedestal is actually not there in the hallway right now. It went out on loan to the Library of Congress. So instead, what's on that pedestal is this great statue that you see on the left. This is a statue of Sojourner Truth, and you can see that it doesn't look anything like the other images. It's a full body sculpture, and she's got in green bronze, she's got a elongated neck and long arms and legs. So it looks like she's not just standing there, she's striding forward and making change. Sojourner Truth is known for the work that she did to work for the end of slavery, but she was also someone that really fought for women's rights and women's right to vote, and would go to women's rights conventions and stand up and call out really the people there who were forgetting about the needs of Black women. I want to point out one of the things Sojourner Truth did. She was one of those first influencers. She would get her picture taken and sell those cards as a way to raise money for her traveling and her activism. In this card, I don't know if you can see, but she's got her knitting arranged on her skirt in a shape of the United States. So even in that image, she was sending the message, you might not think of Black women as Americans, but we're Americans too. And these stories are about us too. But as I mentioned, we're talking a lot about Alice Paul. Now, Alice Paul is coming into a movement in the early 1900s that's got a lot of older women who've been fighting for a long time for the right to vote. And she comes in pretty much just out of graduate school, with new ideas and new ways of doing things. And the older women kind of said, you know, I don't know who you think you are, lady. You haven't been in the trenches like us all this time. You need to sit down and wait your turn. But Alice Paul was not interested in waiting her turn. So if it seems to you like maybe you're too young to make a change, that's what they told Alice, and she wasn't interested in that story. She came into the suffrage movement and decided what we need is things that really get people's attention. So this is a museum panel in the museum telling the story about the first thing that Alice Paul did, which was she decided we need to get thousands of women from around the country to come to Washington, D.C. and hold a procession down Pennsylvania Avenue on March 3rd, 1913, which was the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. She said, we are going to take up the inaugural route and make the point that, you know, you're having this big important moment and women have been left out of this whole political process. And we're going to make sure that we're expressing our displeasure, and tomorrow the president's going to have to walk in our footsteps on his inaugural parade. And she picked this woman to lead. This is Inez Milholland. Now, we don't know her name today, maybe, but everybody knew who Inez was at the time. She was very accomplished. She was a lawyer. She was a civil rights advocate. She was a dynamic speaker. But the reason people really knew who she was because she was very pretty. Beauty gets things done. And so she can, Alice Paul convinces her to lead the procession all in white on a white horse, the herald of the future. By the way, that headgear she's wearing there, that crown, that eventually inspired Wonder Woman's tiara. So Inez is like the first Wonder Woman. But you can see this is really kind of a picture of one kind of educated, wealthy white woman. That's the idea Alice Paul has for this procession. Well, here are some women who wanted to march. These are some young women from Howard University. They just formed a new sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, and they wanted to march in the college section. And Alice Paul, working in the early 1900s, is getting messages that if Black women march in the procession, then white women from the South won't, and it will be a big mess. Alice, you can't let the Deltas march in the procession. And they want to march with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell, who is really internationally known as a civil rights advocate and a woman suffragist, someone who is fighting for women's right to vote. They demanded that they be included, and they did march with the with the other women, the other college women. And Mary Church Terrell said the person who made the difference was Inez Milholland. She was the one who told Alice, you got to let them march. So if Inez is the symbol of the new woman of the 20th century that Alice wants to put out there, one of the things she should be paying attention to is that the new woman is someone who's inclusive. Here's another woman who ran into some trouble with the procession. My favorite suffragist, B Wells Barnett. She was world famous as a journalist and as someone who was fighting against racial oppression and violence. She traveled around the world. She was also someone who fought for women's right to vote, a suffragist. And she was living in Chicago, so she came with the Illinois suffragists. But when they went to line up with the group of women from Illinois, the white women told her she couldn't march with them, that Black women had to go march in the back. And Ida got very angry and said, I came here to represent Illinois. I'll march with Illinois or not at all, and stormed off. But she didn't leave or go to the back. She waited along the procession route. And when the Illinois suffragists came by, she stepped right out in front. Now, we don't have a great picture of this. This is a picture of the newspaper that caught this moment. This is Ida B. Wells right here in the middle with that a very determined look on her face, marching with the other Illinois suffragists. So Alice was able to get thousands of women to march representing their colleges or their states. There were floats, there were women marching with their professions, there were bands. So it got a lot of attention, but not just because it was a great procession. It also got a lot of attention because there was violence. There were about 250,000 people who came out to see this procession, and the police didn't do anything to control the crowd, so they all swarmed into the street. This is Pennsylvania Avenue, filled with people. You can't even tell there's a parade going on at all anymore. And women ended up getting kicked and spit on and trampled, became a huge melee. They did finally clear the route with the army coming in and finish the procession. And the next day, the newspapers weren't really talking about Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. They were all talking about the women's suffrage procession. So Alice had succeeded in getting everybody's attention. But one march, maybe you've heard about marches and things in the news lately, and people demonstrating. Those are important for getting people talking, but marches by themselves don't change things. So once you got everybody's attention, you got to keep the message out there. And one of the things that Alice Paul and her new organization called the National Women's Party did, they published a newspaper, and they had their own political cartoonist, Nina Allender. This is her with a lot of her cartoons behind her there. And the reason they had a cartoonist is because this is what the story was about who suffragists were. They were angry, they were violent and crazy, they were ugly. Here they are attacking a policeman. This is a cartoon kind of saying, this is what we think of the suffragists. And think about the people who really got attacked were the suffragists themselves. So you had to change that perception. So Nina Allender drew suffragists as young and attractive and stylish. They were wearing the latest styles. They were out in public, looking composed and very reasonable. That's the story that Nina Allender was telling with her cartoons. But one of the things about political cartoons is they also are often very funny, and they get a lot of the message out with just the things you see in the picture. So this is one of Nina Allender's cartoons. Got a lot going on here. You've got Cinderella, who is the woman without the vote. And what she wants, and this is what Alice Paul has decided they need, is a constitutional amendment. They want to change the US Constitution so that it would ensure that women across the country would have the right to vote. But to change the Constitution, you got to get it passed through the Congress, through the House and the Senate. And here you see here the House and the Senate members, they're a bunch of mice or maybe rats, not getting anything done. So she's looking to her fairy godmother to wave the magic wand and transform those rats in the House and the Senate. But if you're noticing that that fairy godmother looks kind of funny, that's because that's the face of Woodrow Wilson. That's the president. So this is, they're saying, President Wilson, you've got the power, wave your magic wand and make things change so that we can get our constitutional amendment. It's kind of making fun of Woodrow Wilson too. So this is a room in the museum that's showing all the different kind of things that they did to work to change the Constitution, the lobbying, the advertising, the newspaper. But there's one thing that they're really known for, and I'm going to play a short clip of my friend Ranger Manny to tell you that story.
Hey, look, I'm picketing the White House. Listen, next time you get to Washington, D.C., swing by the White House and you will see people picketing. People carrying signs and banners of protest or concern. Happens day and night. Well, picketing the White House was actually invented by the American suffragist Alice Paul. In response to the intransigence of Woodrow Wilson regarding giving women the vote, Alice Paul formed what were called the Silent Sentinels. This is January 1917. These women stood right outside Woodrow Wilson's front gate. He couldn't help but see them. It was right in his face, carrying banners that said, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" Or, "How long, Mr. President, must women wait for liberty?" It was through the pressure of women like this, as well as others, exerted enough pressure on Woodrow Wilson where finally he goes before Congress, supports the 19th Amendment. Today, 100 years later, women have the vote. But let's not kid ourselves. The struggle for women's equality continues, and it's something we all need to be participating in.
Oops. So one of the things Ranger Manny mentioned is that they really did, well, Woodrow Wilson changed his mind. He said it wasn't because of those picketers, but he did eventually begin to support the idea of a constitutional amendment giving women the vote, and he worked to get it passed. So this is just a question to think about in a time when things are so divided and people have such different opinions. Think of a time that you changed your mind. What was it that convinced you? And here's a couple of women picketing the White House with a young girl bringing them flowers. One thing you'll notice is that they're carrying these banners with 3 colors on them. You can't tell from the black and white picture what those are, but those are the signature trademark colors of these suffragists: purple, white, and gold. You'll notice they also wore sashes with those same colors and carried the banners. They don't have any words on them because this had become so well known. Women would wear these sashes to the market. They'd wear them when they were out in public, sending the message, we want the vote. So that wherever you went, there were women that were getting the message out that women should have the vote. And here you can tell in this picture, here's some women picketing at another place, not at the White House. And you know right away when you look at them, who are the suffragists? Well, they're the ones wearing all white. They're the ones wearing the purple, white, and gold sashes and carrying the banners. And so the way you can get a lot of your message out by what people see without even talking about it. So this is one of my colleagues, and you can tell she is a park ranger like me because of her uniform. She's got an arrowhead on the shoulder here. She's wearing the badge. So if Ranger Lauren walking around, you know right away she's wearing a park ranger. You'd really know it if she was outside and wearing her ranger hat. That's kind of those symbols. People know what that means. So here's a bunch of women picketing the White House. Looks like maybe they're all suffragists. We got people with the banners. This woman's wearing all white. She is not a suffragist. She is a police officer. One of the things that these women were fighting for was not just the right to vote, but equality in everything. And one of the things they fought for was women in professions, including the ability to be police officers. She doesn't look like a police officer because they wouldn't let women wear the uniform. The reason she's there is because the police have gotten fed up with these women picketing every day and causing trouble. And so they've told them to stop. The women aren't stopping. This police officer is confiscating their banners, and she will soon arrest these two women right here. Here's a picture of another day of women getting arrested, because even after they got arrested the first day, they kept showing up and kept getting arrested. You can tell who the suffragists are here with their banners and sashes. There's a police officer there in the middle. Now she's got, you can see her badge there, but here's a man police officer. He gets to wear the uniform, so you can tell the difference. And you can see a whole crowd has gathered because people were getting angrier and angrier at these women for showing up and causing all this trouble. And they would even attack them. And women kept showing up, kept getting arrested and going to jail. And so that was getting more publicity. So they had to be very brave to do that. Think about if you were a police officer and you'd been given the job of arresting the suffragists, how would you feel about that? They also carried banners, and that's one of the things that's in our collection, not just with colors, but with words. So if you see people picketing today with signs, the suffragists started that. Here's a couple of other banners. The young are at the gates, forward out of darkness, leave behind the night, forward out of error, forward into light. So if you've seen people picketing, like with, this is a picture of the March on Washington, you can see they're all holding signs, getting their message out through signs. That was something that started with the women fighting for the right to vote. You can see these ones have messages that are really clear. We want voting rights. People still marching for voting rights in 1963 and even today. End to police brutality. They're getting their message out about what they want at the March on Washington. And this is probably a picture that you're even more familiar with. This is in the summer of 2020. You can tell it's after the pandemic because people are wearing masks with slogans that you're probably familiar with. Maybe you're not familiar with forward into light, but Black Lives Matter, no justice, no peace, wearing a pride flag on her backpack there, getting the message out. So this is something that's still happening today. And think about whether that's effective. Another thing the suffragists did, those women who went to jail weren't ashamed of it. They wore it as a badge of honor and wore these jail door pins. So this is a pin that's in our collection here. All the women who went to jail wore the pins so they could say, yes, I'm a suffragist and I was willing to go to jail. You can't shame me by going to jail. We're continuing to fight. And this you can see is a woman wearing her jail door pin. She's smiling and ripping up some petitions because in August of 1920, what had seemed impossible when they started finally happened. The women won the vote. The constitutional amendment passed Congress and was ratified by the needed states and became part of the US Constitution. So now the right to vote cannot be denied based on sex. Yay, victory. But right away, Alice Paul said, well, that's not the end, that's just the beginning. She said, it's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality won. It has just begun. And just as Ranger Manny said, it's a fight that continues. So think about the things that are important to you, what issues are important to you, and what you can do for change. Here's a climate change march, and you can see all the things that you saw from the suffragists, the colors, the signs, getting the message out. So I'd love to see if there's any questions or anything that I can answer that anybody's wondering about.
Yes, Susan, thank you so much for sharing all that. We do have some questions. So we have two of our interns with the National History Academy, Ben and Anjali, who are going to help us out with that.
Uh, Thanks. Great presentation and a lot of good information. So let's start talking about some questions. Well, first of all, since something you mentioned at the beginning, is there an estimated date for when the site will be open again in person?
So that picture I showed is not what the site actually looks like right now on the outside, because right now it's covered with scaffolding, because we have just started a new renovation project. So the site never did open after we closed for the COVID pandemic, but now we're definitely not going to open for at least another year because there's a major renovation project happening. So all those exhibits that I showed you actually doesn't look like that right now. We've dismantled them all because of big renovation projects happening. So probably not until spring or summer of 2023.
Great. What is the process like when creating displays at the site? How do you decide what goes into it? What information to share?
Oh, what a great question. So when this site became a National Park Service site in 2016, it was already a museum. So the National Women's Party had created the exhibits, and we were just sort of stepping in and telling the story from there. And they had worked on a lot of things, got a lot of great things in the exhibits, but realized there was a lot of the story that isn't being told there. So as part of the renovation, one of the things we hope to do is to redo the exhibits, because if you were just there looking at the exhibits, you wouldn't see that story I told about Mary Church Terrell. You wouldn't see the story about Ida B. Wells. You'd see the statue of Sojourner Truth with no really explanation of why it's there. So we're hoping that when we redo the exhibits, that we'll do a better job of telling more of those stories.
Thank you. Yeah, we wanted to sort of get a tone for, and it comes across in your presentation as well, but how do you balance as an educative site the sort of political nature of history, and especially when you're talking about something like the women's push for equality, how do you deal with how heightened political tensions are, and especially around history now, maybe more than ever in this country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say, first of all history is political, and all history makes you uncomfortable. I'm sorry to say. So there's going to be things, there are always good stories, right? Women fought for the vote and they won it, but it's never simple. There's always a lot more to it. And so what we want to do in the story is give people the stories about what happened and open it up for people to ask questions, to wrestle with these things, to talk about things and say, wait a minute, that's different than what I thought. And now I'm not sure how I feel about Alice Paul or whatever it is. What we don't want to do is be partisan. So we'll talk about that we're the site for women's equality. So we tell stories about people fighting for equality, but we're never going to say, and this is how you do it. This thing has to pass. This thing has to happen. What we want it to be is a space where people can come, learn about the past, and think about the future and talk about those things.
Thank you. So obviously this is such an important site and obviously a wonderful story to preserve and keep telling, as you highlighted at the end of your presentation and really all throughout your presentation. But how did this become a part of the National Park Service? What was that like?
Yeah, so you might have noticed on our very long name, Belmont Paul Women's Equality is National Monument. And sometimes people think when they hear there's a monument, they're looking for a statue. But this monument actually is the house. The house is the monument. The reason it's a national monument and not, say, a national historical site is because a monument can be declared by a president, where a historical site has to pass through Congress. And there have been throughout history women, you know, the Senate is right there, the Capitol's right nearby. The Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court, looked out of her office window at this site. So lots of people in government wanted this, make sure this site was preserved and the story was told for the American people. But it's hard to get things through Congress, as the suffragists learned. And so President Obama declared it a national monument after years and years and years of lobbying in April 2016. So that's how it became part of the Park Service.
Awesome. Let's see. Does the site actively search for artifacts to add to the collection?
So the National Women's Party cared for the collection right up until December 2020. So the organization Alice Paul started lasted over 100 years. But after they did the work of the site becoming in a National Park Service, the National Women's Party wound down, joined with the Alice Paul Institute in New Jersey, and they transferred the collections to the National Park Service to take care of. A lot of things went to the Library of Congress, papers and pictures and things, and those suffrage cartoons. But now we're in the process of doing what collections managers call processing the collection. So the National Women's Party was collecting things. There are things in the collection, say from the Women's March in 2017. But right now, no, the National Park Service is not. We're just working with the stuff we just got. So we're not collecting any new things right now.
Beyond suffrage, what were Alice Paul's main goals for achieving equality?
Yeah, so I mentioned the National Women's Party was around for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they won the vote in 1920, but they kept going. So they put their headquarters right down there in Capitol Hill to lobby for legislation for all the different ways that all the different levels that women are treated differently under the law. They fought to support women running for office. That is something that women won the vote in 1920, but women running for office has not, has taken a long time for that to happen, for women to see themselves as candidates at all levels of government and to run and to be part of the work of making decisions. You can't just be casting the ballot. Your name's got to be on the ballot if you really want to make change. And then there's one other thing that Alice Paul did was go back to the idea of changing the US Constitution. In 1923, they introduced what would become known as the Equal Rights Amendment. And the rest of the National Women's Party political career, they were fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. It did pass Congress 50 years ago, this year in 1972, but to change the US Constitution takes two things: passing Congress and being ratified by 3/4 of the states. And that part is more complicated than I probably can tell in our short story here. But if anybody would like a story about the Equal Rights Amendment, send us an email. We'd love to do an Equal Rights Amendment program for you.
Yeah, that's great, because we just the other year added into our regular rotation of Harvard case method history cases, one on the ERA. Now that's ongoing, very ongoing piece of history. We wanted to ask a sort of maybe twofold question about concerning intersectionality. As you mentioned, Sojourner Truth, and we're here at the beginning of Black History Month virtually visiting you. So perhaps twofold in the sense of, how do you as a site try and manage that, you know, talking about women's history as well as where intersectionality comes in, and also how maybe Alice Paul and those women's organizations of the early to mid 20th century differed from the very troubling Susan B. Anthony iteration that Sojourner Truth had to interact with.
I wish I could say that Alice Paul differed from the troubling history of, so Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the next generation, Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, all of them, you know, worked with Black women, cared about all women, they said, but then did not listen to Black women, didn't bring women from other backgrounds into leadership very often. And when it came to, one of the things Mary Church Terrell said is, and she worked with Alice Paul, she picketed the White House with the National Women's Party, but she said, I think if Alice Paul could get the vote just for white women, she would. And that's a story that continued right, into the women's equality, women's liberation movement, that the women who were in charge were often straight, white, middle class or wealthy women, and they would not often even let in or listen to the voices of women who differed from them. And that is a story that right now, if you look at the exhibits, or the exhibits that were there, the story's not there, but we try to tell it both with these kind of things when we're talking with people, and also with the content that we have online. So since we've had to go virtual, since we can't go to the site anymore, one of the things we've done in the build up to the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and beyond is try to really have good in-depth content that's on the website. So I invite you to check out the National Park Service website. There's all kinds of things, including that clip I showed you was from a video series we did called Suffrage in 60 Seconds. So hopefully you'll find some good things there.
Great. I just have another question following up on Ben's question of intersectionality. I can only imagine how frustrating it was for Black women to be disbarred from these meetings, from having their voices heard. Did any of them break away and start their own movements for equality? And how did that, I can imagine that they did, but how did that interact and or compete with the more mainstream movement?
Yeah, so one of the things that Black women did really from even before the Civil War, they would work with white women's groups, but they'd also form their own groups. So church groups and, kind of benevolent societies and local supporting their community. And within those women's clubs, they would also support women's right to vote. So in 1896, an organization was formed that became kind of a national support organization for all of those affiliate clubs, called the National Association of Colored Women. Mary Church Terrell was the first president, to support and give resources and get the message out. So while they would interact with and even join the groups led for white women, they would form their own as well. And for other groups of women as well, for instance, Native American women. So even when women won the vote in 1920, Native Americans were not in general considered US citizens. So Native American women couldn't vote. And so there were women who marched in the procession, like Marie Bottineau Baldwin and Zacalasa, who fought for Native American rights, tried to get groups like the National Women's Party to support them without luck. So it's this combination of both forming their own organizations and then trying to interact with the groups led by white women, since they had more political power, to varying effects.
Awesome. Well, thanks for a great presentation and for great answers to our questions and everything. We always like to end by asking you, as our great presenter, maybe how you got to where you are working at this great site, and if you had any advice to young folks who might want to do something like this in the future.
Yeah, so one thing I would say about the National Park Service is I wish I had known about it when I was younger. I went into a completely different field for a long time that didn't give me the satisfaction and the passion that being able to tell these stories has done. And so I had a little harder time getting in. One of the things is that I did study history, and my master's degree, I was particularly focused on civil rights history, civil rights in DC history, the African-American, the Black freedom struggle. But I didn't know this story, even though there are parallels to that story. So when this site became a National Park Service site, I was working for the National Mall, and it's part of the National Mall. And I said, oh, I want to go there because those are the stories I want to tell. But for young people who have the benefit of knowing about all these great careers in the National Park Service, there are lots of internships and other ways to get to know what the Park Service does, and see, because the Park Service does so many things. I'm an inside city history person, but of course, a lot of the national parks are big outdoor things. So there's all sorts of things that happen. And so there's a group called the Youth Conservation Corps, YCC. There are preservation internships and other sorts of internships to get in and then get to know what kind of things you like and learn the ways. Because getting to work in the government can sometimes be a little bit of a difficult process. So getting to know people is a great way to find your way through.
Susan, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for this entire presentation. And I do just want to add, I added in the chat, there's a link to a survey. So any of our students watching, if you could please just take a quick minute and fill that out for Susan, and that would be great.
Yes, so we are part of a program, particularly as we're moving to so much virtual, of really wanting to get better at our programming and find new ways. So we need your help to make these programs great for other students like you. If you could give us your feedback. Most of the questions you'll be answering on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means the program had no influence on you at all, and 10 means that it changed your life. You'll probably answer somewhere in between the two ends of this scale. It's perfectly okay if you have different answers for each question. There are no right or wrong answers, so please answer with your honest opinions and work alone to complete the survey. Your responses will help us improve the programs like this one for the future. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, of course. And thank you again for joining us. We are absolutely going to be reaching out for more about the ERA and for our summer program, because it's a perfect fit.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you everyone at home for joining today. We'll be back here next week, Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern time, as we virtually visit with the National Association for Olmsted Parks. I hope to see you there, and have a wonderful rest of your day.